Good evening and welcome to the tidbits on the Parsha, the weekly Torah portion, which this week is Vayera, literally, and he appeared. He refers to God, appeared to Abraham, and if we backtrack to the verse before this, to the verses before this, it seems that this is in conjunction with something that just happened. What happened before this? Abraham circumcised himself and his entire household of males. And at that point, it says, God appeared to him. What's the connection? So Rashi says, if Abraham is ailing from circumcision, remember, he was 99 years old, and this was what you can call auto-circumcision. He did it to himself. I don't know if he had a license, so we're not going to report it to the authorities, and we'll keep it between ourselves. But God came to visit him to fulfill the mitzvah of visiting the sick. Because one of the things that our sages teach us is that there is a commandment to follow in God's ways, to emulate God. So just as God visits the sick, so too we are commanded to visit the sick. And this is where this mitzvah is first mentioned or alluded to in the Torah. And Rashi adds another interesting point. It says it happened on the third day after he had been circumcised. Why the third day? If he was ailing for 3 days, he should have visited him the first day, second day. Why wait till the third day? So the Rabbi once explained that a mitzvah has to be performed within the realm of nature. That means that if one chooses to do a mitzvah by cutting corners, in other words, by overriding the natural boundaries or barriers, by rising to a spiritual, supernatural state where they can just do the mitzvah without the natural barriers that they have to overcome, that's not an ideal mitzvah. Because the purpose of a mitzvah is to affect the natural world. So it has to be done within the parameters of the natural world. And the Rebbe told a story, a famous story, when the Alter Rebbe was charged with treason. First Chabad Rebbe was charged with treason, that he was setting himself up as a rival to the Tsar, and he was taken to the capital, and he was transported from one prison structure to another by way of a river. And he was in this boat, and he sees that it's a clear night, and he can see the moon, and there's a practice the Jews have that every month we recite the prayer called Kiddush Levana. We sanctify the new moon. And he knew that this might be his last opportunity to see the moon, so he asked the guard who was rowing the boat, could he please stop the boat so he could concentrate on the prayer? And the guard scoffed at him. A prisoner was telling me what to do, and he refused to stop the boat. So the Alter Rebbe, through his miraculous powers, stopped the boat. And after he stopped the boat, he said a preliminary psalm, because the way this prayer works, there's a preliminary psalm, then the blessing, which is the main part of the prayer. And after he finished the preliminary psalm, he allowed the boat to continue. As the boat is continuing on its way, he says to the boat driver, could you please stop the boat so I can say the rest of the prayer? At that point, he realized he's dealing with a holy man, and he stopped the boat. And the question was asked, I believe, by the previous Rebbe, why didn't he just continue saying the prayer if he already had stopped the boat and now was in command of it? And the answer is that would have been using a miraculous, a supernatural power that he possessed to do a mitzvah. And that's not the ideal way of doing a mitzvah. So how does this connect to Abraham ailing for 3 days and God coming on the third day? Because it's natural for a person undergoing circumcision to ail for 3 days. When 3 days come to an end, that's when the person heals. So God waited until it would be natural for him to heal. And God sends him these 3 people, really angels. One of them was the angel Raphael, the healing angel, to heal him. And the Rebbe then asked, well, if it was natural for him to be healed, why did God have to come to heal him? Why did he have to send an angel to heal him? And the Rebbe answers, because most people, overwhelmingly, do not see the godly involvement in one's healing. One does not see the natural forces, the spiritual natural forces behind the healing, which are God's instruments. Abraham, on the other hand, was in contact with God, the source of healing, and the angel, which is the instrument of healing. But it was done at a time when it would be natural for him to heal. God appears to Abraham. A story is told of the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber, when he was about 4 or 5 years old. Apparently had studied this in his kindergarten, and he comes running to his grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek, the 3rd Chabad Rebbe, crying bitterly, why is it that God appears to Abraham and he doesn't appear to us? And the Tzemach Tzedek, as he's known by title of his magnum opus, answered, if a Jew, a tzaddik, a righteous Jew, at the age of 99, recognizes that he needs to be circumcised, then he's worthy of God appearing to him. The meaning of that is that God's appearing to him required that even as he reached that pinnacle of his life, right short of 100 years, 100 is a symbol of perfection, and he realizes how imperfect he is, because in terms of our relationship with God, it's infinite, then he is worthy that God should appear. But the Rebbe also derived from this a powerful lesson for children in our own time, that we are living on the cusp of the future Messianic age, the age of redemption. And even a child today, because we're so close to that period, could demand being able to have God appear to him or her. And a child does not necessarily have to be bribed, as was always the custom. You give the child a toy, a candy, for him to do a mitzvah. The child is now in possession of this deeper force that he could come running and crying, wanting to have God reveal himself to us. Where does God appear to Abraham? In the plains of Mamre. Mamre was one of Abraham's friends. Abraham had 3 friends, Oner, Heschel, and Mamre. Why does God appear to him in the plains of Mamre, or why is it important for the Torah to indicate that? So Rashi says, Hu shenasno etza al hamila. He was the one who gave Abraham advice concerning circumcision. That's why God revealed to him, to Abraham, in his area, the land that belonged to him. This sounds like Abraham wasn't sure if he should circumcise himself, even though God had commanded him to do so. And it was Mamre, this heathen, who gives him the advice to circumcise himself. So it appears that Mamre was more devoted to God than Abraham. Abraham had qualms. Mamre did not. So this question is asked by medieval commentators. One of them, the Tosafos, answers that Abraham was not looking for advice whether or not to fulfill God's command. Rather, Abraham wanted to know if he should do it in private, making it into a private affair, no one has to know about it, or he should do it publicly. Let everyone know that I, Abraham, am a Jew. I have fulfilled God's commandment to circumcise myself. But even that requires some clarification, because why would Abraham, who was always doing everything in public, proclaiming God's unity and need for kindness and justice and fairness throughout the world, why would this be any different? And one possible answer is Abraham's life's mission was to spread God's message to the world, the message of one God, the message of the 7 Noahide commandments, the message of God's insistence in kindness, compassion. And Abraham was very successful at that. He was concerned that if he would circumcise himself in public, that means everyone would know about it, that would erect a wall, a barrier between him and the rest of the world, because it would be like Abraham saying, until now, I was just like you. I had to believe in one God. I had to fulfill the 7 Noahide commandments. And I'm trying to impress upon you that you should do the same. But now Abraham is saying, I'm different. I am circumcised. I am perfect. I am a Jew. And you're not. Then how could he come to them and try to inspire them and influence them to follow in the ways that God had intended for all humanity? He felt that his message would not be accepted. And that's why he went to Mamre. Because if you want to test a message, who do you go to? You go to the people to whom the message will affect. So he's now going to Mamre, who was not obviously in the same league as Abraham. And he says to him, what do you think? Will my circumcision make me a pariah? Will make me unacceptable to everyone? Or perhaps I won't suffer. And Mamre said, no, go ahead with it. Make it a public affair, because then they'll respect you. And this is the message for today. When a Jew is afraid to behave Jewishly and being different from everyone else, not because he's afraid of anti-Semitism, that's a separate issue, but he's afraid that his ability to influence the world and to do good for the world will be hampered because people won't accept it because you're different. No, it's the other way around. And it could be that anti-Semitism, one of its causes at least, is because Jews are trying to tell the world we're not different. And they say to us, yes, you are different. You have a special mission. And that's indicated by the covenant that God made with you. Well, what happens? At this point, Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent, and it's in the heat of the day. Let me give you some background based on Rashi, and Rashi is based on earlier sources, Talmudic Midrash sources. Abraham was Eli. Abraham was a man who opened his tent on all 4 sides for guests. One of the reasons when we get married, we have a chuppah canopy that's open on 4 sides, just held up by 4 poles, is because we want our home to be like Abraham's home, that had entrances on all 4 sides, so that nobody would miss his home to be a place where they can get food, shelter, and what have you. So Abraham devoted his life to this type of kindness, a life of hospitality where he would invite everyone into his home. And God didn't want him to be disturbed by wayfarers, because what happens with an ailing 99-year-old man after surgery running back and forth to take care of his guests? So God took the sun out of its sheath, which means God made it so unbearably hot that no human being would ever walk through the desert on that day. But then Abraham was disturbed even more, because now he couldn't express his kindness. It literally hurt him when he could not do an act of kindness. So God couldn't send humans, it's too hot. So he sends angels disguised as humans. And Abraham sees them and he's all excited and he runs. Remember this. After my bris, I couldn't walk for a year, let alone run. And this is 3 days later. He's running towards his guests and he brings them in. He has them wash their feet. He offers them some refreshments, but he doesn't just give them some bread and then let them go. He takes cattle, he prepares it, and he gets butter and milk and bread and everything that could have satisfied a real hungry person. And he not only served it to them, he stood over them, waiting for them to eat it, willing to respond to every whim of theirs. This was Abraham's degree of hospitality. And the Talmud derives a very powerful lesson from this. Here God appears to Abraham. So God is now in Abraham's presence. And Abraham says to God, God, please don't go. I'm busy now. I have to tend to a more important matter. So stay here. I'll be back to you later. From here, the Talmud derives that entertaining guests, bringing guests into your home, is greater than greeting the face of the divine presence. That's a very powerful statement. My father, with blessed memory, once gave this very beautiful explanation. When we talk about inviting guests, we don't mean inviting your neighbors for a dinner. That's very nice, but we're talking about people who are traveling, who don't have a home, who don't have where to stay. They're temporarily homeless. The Talmud makes a very strong statement about homelessness, that unlike other deficits, for people that don't have enough food, enough clothing, which is a terrible scourge when that happens, but the Talmud only applies the following to the case of a person without a home. That a person without a home is not a complete human being. Why is the home more important for a person's human dignity than food and clothing? And my father explained that's because the home is the only place where you can be yourself. Every other place where a person functions, they're on a stage. They're acting in a way to appeal to the listeners. If they're talking, if they're teaching, whatever, even if you're just chatting, you will put on a certain air about yourself. You will behave in a certain manner. You will be a little bit more cautious about what you say, how you say it, where you say it, when you say it. But as soon as a person comes home, they can throw off their jacket, they can be dressed or undressed, they can say whatever they want. They're themselves. They're in touch with their true persona, because we have two personas, the private persona and the public persona. Well, a person who is homeless doesn't have a private persona. He never experiences his true human dignity because he's always outside. A traveler, although not homeless entirely, but still on the road, you don't have a home, you lose some of that human dignity. And therefore, when you bring him into your house, you're creating a human being out of someone who is lacking in their humanity. You become God's partner. So being God's partner is superior to just greeting God where you're on the receiving end. Being a partner is greater than being a recipient from someone. There's a story told about with Rabbi Yitzchak of Baditchev, the great Hasidic master. He once came to a town, but he didn't announce himself, although everyone who heard of him knew of him as the greatest rabbi in that whole region. And he needed a place to stay, so he goes to the home of one of the wealthiest Jews in town, and a beautiful, huge mansion. And he knocks on the door and he says, "Can I have a meal? Could you please offer me some food? I've been traveling and I haven't eaten." And the man said, "I'm sorry, we don't have any food left over. But maybe you can give me a room, small room to sleep. I don't have a place to rest my weary bones." And the man says, "No, sorry, we have no place for you." So he leaves and he goes to the house of one of the poor members of the community. And he knocks on the door and he asks him if he could stay. The man says, "Sure." And he brings him in, gives him whatever food he had, gives him a place to sleep. But then the man recognizes this is Rabbi Yitzchak of Baditchev. So within a few hours, the entire city is coming to greet him, including this rich man who was also shocked to know that the person he had just sent away was Rabbi Yitzchak. And he comes to Rabbi Yitzchak and he says, "Why don't you come to my house? I didn't know it was you, the great rabbi. I would have given you a room and food and everything else. Come to my house." And Rabbi Yitzchak answered, no. He says, "We know that Abraham was great in hospitality, and the Torah makes a big fuss about it. Why does the Torah not make a fuss about his nephew, Lot, who also was hospitable? So the difference is like this. The people who came to Lot, the angels that came to Lot, came as angels. He knew there were angels. Of course, angels come to your house, you're going to invite them in. When Abraham saw these angels, they were disguised as people and as a lowly class of people. And notwithstanding that, Abraham brought them in. That's the true nature of hospitality. One of the angels tells Abraham, next year you're going to have a child. And Sarah overhears this, and she laughs. How could she have a child? She's too old. And God says to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? And then when Abraham tells Sarah what he heard from God, she says, no, I didn't laugh. So the question is, how could it be that Sarah laughed, number one, by being cynical? Number two, why did she deny it? Sarah was the most righteous woman, one of the most, if not the most righteous woman in all of history. And yet, she laughed, had less faith in God than you would expect of her, and then didn't tell the truth about it. So there's a Hasidic interpretation given by the Sfas Emes, the Rambam Ger, who says that Sarah did not laugh consciously. She laughed subconsciously. Somewhere deep in her subconscious, it was a shred, a scintilla of doubt. Consciously, she had no problem. But in the deepest layers of her psyche, she had that scintilla of doubt whether it's possible for her to have a child. And therefore, when she denied it, she didn't know that she laughed because she was not aware of what happened in her subconscious. Many people attribute the knowledge of the subconscious to Freud, but it's something that was known to Hasidic masters, and it's rooted in the Talmud as well. Let's skip to the end of the parsha, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. There's a lot more to discuss, but we're just going to limit it to the Akedah. Everyone asked the question. God tells Abraham he's going to destroy the city of Sodom. Most evil people, unbelievable evil. Abraham prays for them. Unsuccessfully, but he prayed for them. God tells him to slaughter his son Isaac, and he doesn't utter a word of, please God, why do you want that? What did he do wrong? He's so righteous. Not a word of protest, not a word of prayer. But he gets up and he does everything he's told to do. He doesn't hesitate for a moment. That's a question that I hear people asking. When I grew up, I never heard anyone asking this question. But I think the answer is quite obvious. There's a difference between God giving you a certain statement of fact. Why does God tell us, tell Abraham, I'm going to destroy the city of stone? Why is it Abraham's business to know that? Does God tell everybody everything he's going to do? No. But he does tell certain people certain things. So it's obvious that God is telling them because he wants them to react to. We see suffering in the world. So we know that God brings suffering in the world. Is it God's will? Obviously it's God's will. If God didn't will it, it couldn't happen. Contrary to those who say that God is not in control, that's absolute heresy. God is in control of every little detail of existence. So if God allows something terrible to happen, do you still say it's God's will? Let's not try to stop it. No, God wants us to stop it. God, for whatever reason he has, and we're not able to understand God, but for whatever reason that he has to bring misfortune on the world, he wants us to fight it and protest it. So therefore, when God tells Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom, God is telling Abraham, this is what I am planning. What are you going to do about it? And Abraham takes the cue, and Abraham starts praying for them. Same thing with Moses. When God tells Moses, I'm going to destroy the Jewish people. Leave go of me. Moses thought to himself, leave go? I'm not holding on to God. But that was God's way of hinting to him, start praying. I'm telling you what I'm going to do so that you should try to circumvent that and prevent that from happening. That's the Jewish way to look at everything that happens in this world. On one hand, we know it's God's will. On the other hand, we know that it's God's will that we counteract it. So there's never a point in time when you say, if God wants people to suffer, let them suffer. It's tragic, we feel bad about it, but we're not going to do anything about it. But when God gives you a commandment to see how loyal you are, if you start protesting it, you demonstrated that you are not capable of meeting God's standards and God's demands. If God would have told him their son Isaac is going to become sick and he's going to die, of course he would have prayed for him. But if he's commanding him, this is his commandment, then of course he had no choice, he had to do it. One of the other lessons, I'll conclude on this note, is that some people say, how could God have commanded him to slaughter his son Isaac? Human sacrifice is horrible. And of course we know that that was not the commandment. That was only a test. But even how could it even be a test? And I'd like to just share a very brief point. It needs a lot more embellishment and clarification, but I think a little bit is necessary. And that is that if someone tells you, why is it wrong to kill it? And they say, because it's just reprehensible, it's just horrible, it's abominable. There's no question. You have to have that attitude. But you know what? For every attitude that a person has that is right, in the extreme, there'll always be people who will say, not necessarily, and there will be people who will argue the opposite. All you have to do is look at the terrorists of today, or the communist murderers of the past, or the Nazi murderers of the past. All you have to do is look at them, and they said, murder, yes, that is acceptable. Hence for who? Not for Aryans, but for Jews. Not for communists, but for counter-revolutionaries. They just changed the terminology. If we would be limiting our abhorrence of murder, of child sacrifice, simply on human feelings, while it would be a good thing, it would not guarantee that people would adhere to it. The Torah, by virtue of this whole story, comes around at the end and says, no, I do not want that type of sacrifice. That sacrifice is abominable. And this was only a test. But once God tells him that this was not what I wanted, this became enshrined, that this is contrary to God's will, and God is absolute, doesn't change. You cannot rationalize. And I know people will ask, well, how come there's a death penalty, and how come there's war? That's a good question, but of course the simple answer is because that's mentioned in the Torah. The same God who prohibits murder doesn't prohibit in those cases. But of course this could lead to much more discussion. This is not the point of our class, just to give you some insights. Have a good Shabbos, a good night. We'll be back, God willing, next week.